The winter of 2019 brought an unusual chill to the mountains of Afghanistan, where temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Commander Jake Morrison watched his breath form clouds in the frigid air as he studied the intelligence reports spread across the makeshift table in their forward operating base. The mission seemed straightforward on paper, but Morrison had learned during his 15 years of service that nothing in this war-torn country was ever simple. 200 of America's elite Navy SEALs had been deployed to the remote Kunar province for Operation Silent Night, a joint mission with Allied forces to eliminate a high-value target who had been orchestrating attacks on coalition forces throughout the region. The target, known only as the Ghost, had evaded capture for 3 years, leaving behind a trail of devastation that included the deaths of dozens of soldiers and countless civilians. Morrison's team had been tracking the Ghost for weeks, following a complex web of intelligence that led them deeper into the treacherous mountain terrain. The enemy commander was reportedly hiding in a fortified compound nestled between 2 towering peaks, surrounded by natural barriers that made approach extremely difficult. What made the situation even more challenging was the timing. Christmas Eve was approaching, and the harsh winter weather had created additional obstacles for the mission. The SEALs had established their base camp in an abandoned village that had been evacuated months earlier due to ongoing conflict. The stone buildings provided some shelter from the biting wind, but the men knew they were exposed and vulnerable in this remote location. Communication with headquarters was spotty at best due to the mountainous terrain interfering with radio signals, leaving them largely on their own. As Morrison reviewed the mission parameters, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The intelligence seemed too clean, too convenient. The Ghost had survived this long by being unpredictable and cunning, yet the reports suggested he was holed up in a location that could be easily surrounded. It felt like a trap, but orders were orders, and the mission had been approved at the highest levels of command. The team consisted of highly trained operators from various SEAL units, each bringing their own expertise to the mission. Among them was Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chun, a sniper whose reputation preceded her. Chun had earned her place among the elite through years of training and combat experience, proving herself time and again in the most challenging conditions. Her precision with a rifle was legendary, and her ability to remain calm under pressure had saved countless lives during previous operations. Chun had grown up in a military family, with both parents serving in different branches of the armed forces. She had always been drawn to the challenge of military service, but her path to becoming a SEAL sniper had been anything but easy. The training was brutal, designed to push candidates beyond their physical and mental limits. Many had questioned whether women could handle the demands of elite special operations, but Chun had silenced her critics through sheer determination and skill. The other team members included explosives experts, communication specialists, medics, and assault troops, all veterans of multiple deployments who had seen their share of combat. They had trained together for months, developing the kind of trust and coordination that could mean the difference between life and death in a firefight. Each man knew he could count on his teammates to watch his back, and that bond had been tested in countless missions across different theaters of operation. As the sun began to set on December 23rd, Morrison gathered his team leaders for a final briefing. The plan called for a coordinated assault on the Ghost's compound at dawn on Christmas Eve. 3 teams would approach from different directions, with Chin's sniper team providing overwatch from a ridge approximately 800 meters from the target. The assault teams would move in under cover of darkness, taking positions around the compound before launching the synchronized attack. The intelligence indicated that the Ghost had approximately 50 fighters with him, armed with rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. The compound itself was described as a series of connected buildings surrounded by high walls, with multiple entry and exit points that needed to be covered simultaneously. Getting in wouldn't be the problem. Getting out with their target might be more challenging. Chin spent the evening checking and rechecking her equipment. Her rifle was a customized version of the standard sniper weapon, modified to her exact specifications over years of use. She had fired thousands of rounds through this particular rifle, knowing exactly how it would behave under different conditions. The cold mountain air would affect the trajectory of her shots, requiring calculations she had practiced countless times in training. The other snipers in her team were equally meticulous in their preparations. They studied maps of the area, identifying potential shooting positions and escape routes. Wind speed and direction were critical factors that could affect accuracy at long range, and the mountain environment created unpredictable air currents that could throw off even the most experienced marksmen. As midnight approached, the temperature continued to drop, and snow began to fall. The weather forecast called for heavy snowfall throughout the night, which could provide additional cover for their approach, but might also complicate visibility during the operation. Morrison made the decision to proceed as planned, knowing that any delay could result in losing their opportunity to capture the ghost. The men tried to get some rest before the mission, but sleep came hard in the cold mountain air. Many lay awake thinking about home, about families they had left behind for this deployment. Christmas Eve had always been a special time for most of them, filled with traditions and celebrations that seemed a world away from this desolate landscape. Shin found herself thinking about her younger brother, who was serving his first deployment with the army in a different part of Afghanistan. She had always felt protective of him, even though he was now a grown man and a soldier in his own right. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were both spending Christmas Eve in the same war zone, fighting the same enemy from different positions. At 3 a.m, Morrison gave the order to begin final preparations. Equipment was distributed, communications checked one last time, and final adjustments made to the plan based on current weather conditions. The snow had stopped falling, but a thick layer covered the ground, which would make movement more difficult but also help muffle their approach. The teams moved out under cover of darkness, each group taking a different route toward their assigned positions. Chin's sniper team had the longest journey, needing to reach their overwatch position on the ridge before the assault teams were in place. They moved carefully through the rocky terrain, using night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous path. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air became thinner and the cold more intense. Each breath burned in their lungs, and the weight of their equipment seemed to increase with every step. But these were men and women who had trained for exactly these conditions, and they pushed forward with the determination that had made them part of America's most elite fighting force. By 5 a.m, all teams were in position. Chun lay prone on the rocky ridge, her rifle trained on the compound below. Through her scope, she could see guards moving along the walls, their movements creating small puffs of vapor in the cold air. The intelligence had been accurate about the layout of the compound, but something still felt off about the entire situation. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, barely audible through the static caused by the mountains. The assault was set to begin in 30 minutes, just as the first light of dawn broke over the eastern peaks. Chun adjusted her scope for the range and environmental conditions, knowing that when the shooting started, there would be no time for second chances. Dawn broke slowly over the Afghan mountains, casting long shadows across the valley where the ghost compound sat like a fortress carved from stone. Chun watched through her scope as the guards completed their morning patrol, noting their patterns and timing. Everything seemed routine, almost too routine for a high-value target who had survived 3 years of manhunts. Morrison's voice came through the radio again, this time clearer as atmospheric conditions improved with the rising sun. The assault teams were in position, waiting for his signal to begin the coordinated attack. Shin could see her teammates through her peripheral vision, each sniper covering a different section of the compound, ready to provide support fire when the operation commenced. At precisely 600 hours, the attack began. The first team breached the eastern wall, while the second team hit the main gate. Explosions echoed through the valley as charges detonated, creating gaps in the compound's defenses. Through her scope, Chun watched as her fellow SEALs poured through the openings, moving with the precision and speed that came from years of training and combat experience. The response from inside the compound was immediate and fierce. Muzzle flashes lit up the morning twilight as defenders opened fire from prepared positions. Chun quickly identified threats and began engaging targets, her rifle barking as she sent precise shots toward enemy fighters who were trying to pin down the assault teams. Her first shot dropped a machine gunner who had been raking the eastern breach with automatic fire. But something was wrong. The resistance was stronger than expected, and the defenders seemed to know exactly where the assault teams would attack. Chen realized that the intelligence had been compromised, that the ghost had been waiting for them. Instead of 50 fighters, there appeared to be at least twice that number, and they were better armed than the reports had indicated. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, calling for immediate extraction as his teams found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The compound had been turned into a killing field, with interlocking fields of fire that made movement extremely dangerous. Several SEALs had already been wounded in the initial assault, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Chen shifted her focus to providing covering fire for the withdrawal, but as she scanned the compound through her scope, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. The ghost himself was visible on one of the rooftops, directing his fighters with hand signals. He was wearing a distinctive white jacket that made him easy to identify against the dark stone of the buildings. She had a clear shot at the high-value target, but taking it would require holding her position while her teammates were trying to extract under heavy fire. The range was challenging, nearly 900 meters with variable wind conditions, but it was within her capabilities. Chun made the calculation quickly, adjusting for distance, wind, and the cold air that would affect bullet trajectory. As she prepared to take the shot, movement caught her eye. Additional enemy fighters were emerging from hidden positions around the compound, far more than anyone had expected. These weren't the local militia fighters they had been briefed about. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and equipped with modern weapons. The ghost had set an elaborate trap, using himself as bait to draw in the SEAL teams. Morrison's teams were now fighting for their lives, pinned down in the compound with enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. The original extraction plan was no longer viable, and ammunition was running low among the assault teams. Chen realized that her sniper team might be the only thing standing between her fellow SEALs and complete disaster. She made contact with Morrison over the radio, informing him of the additional enemy forces she could observe from her elevated position. The situation was even worse than they had thought. The compound was just one part of a larger defensive network that extended throughout the surrounding area. Hidden fighting positions had been carved into the mountainside, creating overlapping kill zones that would make any escape route extremely dangerous. The ghost continued to direct his forces from the rooftop, seemingly unconcerned about sniper fire. Chen realized he probably assumed the Overwatch team had withdrawn with the assault teams, not knowing that she and her teammates were still in position. This gave her a temporary advantage, but she knew it wouldn't last long once the enemy spotted muzzle flashes from the ridge. Making a split-second decision, Chen lined up her shot on the ghost while her teammates focused on providing support fire for the trapped assault teams. The target was partially concealed behind a low wall, but his torso was visible as he continued to coordinate the defense. At this range, with current wind conditions, she would have only one chance before the enemy pinpointed her location and returned fire. The radio chatter grew more desperate as Morrison's teams reported casualties and dwindling ammunition. They had managed to reach a partially defensible position inside the compound, but enemy forces were massing for a final assault that would overwhelm their remaining defenses. Time was running out, and conventional extraction was no longer possible. Chun controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow as she entered the focused state that every sniper trained to achieve. The crosshairs settled on the ghost's center mass, and she began the slow, steady trigger pull that would send the bullet on its 800-meter journey. In that moment, everything else faded away. The cold, the noise of battle, the knowledge that her friends were dying below. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and she immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round while keeping her eye on the target through the scope. The bullet's flight time at this range was just over a second, and she watched as the ghost suddenly spun and fell backward, disappearing behind the wall. Whether the shot had been fatal was impossible to determine, but the immediate effect on the defending forces was noticeable. Confusion spread through the enemy ranks as they lost their commanding officer. Some fighters continued to press the attack on the trapped SEALs, but others began looking around uncertainly, unsure of what to do without direct orders. Chen took advantage of this momentary chaos to engage additional targets. picking off key personnel who seemed to be trying to take command. Her teammates joined in, raining precision fire down on the compound from their concealed positions on the ridge. Years of training and combat experience showed as they systematically eliminated threats, creating temporary windows of opportunity for the assault teams to improve their positions and tend to their wounded. But the enemy quickly adapted, and Chen realized they were facing a much more sophisticated adversary than anyone had anticipated. These weren't just local fighters defending their territory. This was a coordinated military operation designed specifically to trap and eliminate American special forces. The Ghost's apparent death hadn't ended the threat. It had simply activated contingency plans that had been prepared in advance. Heavy weapons fire began impacting around the sniper positions as the enemy located the ridge and began returning fire. Chun and her team found themselves under increasingly accurate artillery fire from mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. The rocky terrain provided some protection, but they couldn't remain in their current positions much longer without being overrun. Morrison's voice came over the radio with an update that confirmed Chin's worst fears. The assault teams had been completely surrounded, with no viable extraction route available. Enemy reinforcements were continuing to arrive from throughout the region, turning what should have been a quick strike mission into a prolonged siege. The SEALs were trapped, outnumbered by at least 10-1, with limited ammunition and no immediate hope of rescue. Chen looked at her remaining ammunition and calculated how long they could continue to provide effective fire support. Her team had perhaps 30 minutes of sustained combat before they would be forced to withdraw or risk being overrun themselves. But leaving now would mean abandoning their trapped teammates to almost certain death. The radio crackled with reports from other SEAL units in the region, all of whom were either too far away to provide immediate assistance or were already engaged with enemy forces themselves. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. The enemy had launched a coordinated offensive across multiple locations, stretching Allied forces thin and preventing mutual support. As mortar rounds continued to impact around their position, Chen made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Instead of withdrawing to safety, she chose to remain in position and continue providing overwatch for her trapped teammates, knowing that her accurate fire might be the only thing keeping them alive until help could arrive. The mountain ridge erupted in a shower of rock and debris as enemy mortars found their range. Chun pressed herself against the cold stone, feeling fragments whistle past her helmet as she maintained her position behind the rifle. Her teammates had spread out along the ridgeline, each finding whatever cover they could while continuing to engage targets in the compound below. Through her scope, Chen could see that Morrison's assault teams had managed to reach a more defensible position inside what appeared to be an old stone warehouse. The building provided better protection than their original location, but they were still completely surrounded by enemy forces who were systematically closing the noose. Every window and doorway had become a potential death trap as enemy fighters moved closer under cover of supporting fire. The radio traffic grew increasingly urgent as ammunition counts dropped and casualty reports mounted. 3 SEALs had been seriously wounded in the initial assault, and the team medic was working frantically to keep them stable while under constant fire. Morrison's voice remained calm and professional, but Chun could hear the underlying tension as he coordinated defensive positions and rationed ammunition among his remaining fighters. Chen's spotter, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rodriguez, crawled up beside her with an updated ammunition count. They were down to less than 40 rounds of precision ammunition, with perhaps a dozen magazines of standard rifle ammunition remaining. At their current rate of engagement, they had maybe 20 minutes before they would be forced to withdraw or risk being completely overrun. But withdrawal wasn't really an option. The path back down the mountain would expose them to fire from multiple enemy positions, and abandoning the high ground would remove the only significant advantage the trapped SEALs had. Chun made the decision to stay and fight, knowing that every accurate shot from her rifle might save the life of a teammate below. She continued to scan the compound and surrounding area, identifying new threats as enemy reinforcements continued to arrive. What surprised her was the level of coordination and equipment these fighters displayed. This wasn't a hastily assembled militia group, but a well-trained military unit with modern weapons and sophisticated tactics. Someone had spent months preparing this ambush, studying American special operations procedures, and developing countermeasures specifically designed to defeat SEAL teams. A new voice came over the radio, speaking with the calm authority of senior command. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the overall mission commander, had been monitoring the situation from the forward operating base and was coordinating rescue efforts. Her assessment was grim but direct. The nearest available reinforcements were at least 6 hours away, and weather conditions were preventing close air support from reaching the area. The trapped SEALs would have to hold their position and survive on their own until help could arrive. Hayes promised that every available resource was being mobilized for extraction, but she couldn't provide a timeline for when relief might reach them. In the meantime, they were authorized to use any means necessary to defend themselves and complete their mission if possible. Chun adjusted her scope and took another shot, dropping an enemy fighter who had been trying to set up a machine gun position that would have had a clear field of fire into the SEAL's defensive position. The return fire was immediate and intense, forcing her to duck as bullets cracked overhead and ricocheted off the rocky terrain around her position. Rodriguez spotted movement in a building adjacent to the compound and called out targets to Chun. She shifted her aim and saw enemy fighters preparing what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade for launch toward the trapped SEALs. The range was extreme, nearly 1,000 meters, but she had no choice but to attempt the shot. A direct hit from an RPG could collapse the warehouse and kill everyone inside. The wind had picked up as the morning progressed, adding another variable to her calculations. Chin estimated the crosswind at approximately 15 miles per hour, gusting to 20. At this range, that would deflect her bullets significantly if not properly compensated for. She made the adjustment and settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing as she had done hundreds of times before. The shot was perfect, catching the enemy fighter just as he prepared to fire the RPG. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as its operator fell, and the other fighters in that position scattered, temporarily disrupting that axis of attack. But Chen knew it was only a temporary reprieve. There would be more RPGs, and eventually one would find its mark. Morrison's voice came over the radio with a tactical update. His teams had identified what appeared to be a supply tunnel or escape route leading from the rear of the warehouse. If they could reach it, they might be able to withdraw to a more defensible position deeper in the compound. But getting there would require crossing an open courtyard under direct fire from multiple enemy positions. Chen studied the area through her scope, identifying the threats that would need to be neutralized to give the assault teams a chance of reaching safety. There were at least 8 enemy positions with clear fields of fire across the courtyard, each requiring precision shots to eliminate. With her remaining ammunition, she could engage perhaps half of those positions before running out of rifle rounds. She made contact with her other team members, coordinating a synchronized engagement that would provide maximum coverage for the assault team's movement. Each sniper would take specific targets, firing simultaneously to prevent the enemy from adjusting their defensive positions. It would be their most challenging shot sequence of the entire engagement, requiring perfect timing and accuracy under extreme pressure. The plan called for Morrison's teams to begin their movement on Chen's signal, a double click of her radio transmitter. She positioned herself for the best angle on the most dangerous enemy position, a machine gun nest that commanded the entire courtyard. Rodriguez fed her range and wind estimates while she made final adjustments to her scope. But as Chen prepared to give the signal, she noticed something that changed everything. Through her scope, she could see that the ghost was not dead after all. Her earlier shot had wounded him, evidenced by the blood-stained jacket and his left arm hanging useless at his side. But he was very much alive and still directing the defense from a new position. More importantly, she could see him coordinating what appeared to be a final assault on the trapped SEALs. Enemy fighters were massing in covered positions around the warehouse, preparing for a coordinated attack that would overwhelm the Americans' defensive positions. The movement was subtle and professional, showing a level of tactical sophistication that explained how the ghost had evaded capture for so long. Chen faced an impossible choice. She could engage the machine gun position to support her teammates' movement, or she could attempt to eliminate the ghost and disrupt the enemy's final assault. Either way, she would only have one chance before enemy fire forced her to abandon her position or risk being killed herself. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, requesting permission to begin the movement. His teams were ready and waiting for her signal, trusting that she and her fellow snipers would provide the covering fire they needed to reach safety. Chen could hear the tension in his voice and knew that waiting much longer would only make the situation worse. She made her decision in a split second, choosing to prioritize the immediate threat to her teammates over the strategic value of eliminating the ghost. The machine gun position had to be neutralized first, even if it meant allowing the enemy commander to escape once again. Chen shifted her aim to the primary target and prepared to give the signal that would begin their desperate attempt to save the trapped SEALs. But as her finger began to squeeze the trigger, movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Additional enemy fighters were approaching the sniper positions from below, having somehow identified their location and organized a ground assault. Chen realized that within minutes, her team would be fighting for their own lives, unable to provide any support for the trapped assault teams below. The tactical situation had become untenable. 200 of America's elite warriors were trapped in an elaborate ambush, running low on ammunition and facing overwhelming odds. The sniper teams that represented their only hope of survival were about to be overrun themselves. Christmas Eve 2019 was turning into one of the darkest days in recent military history, with no clear path to victory or even survival. The sound of boots on stone echoed up from the valley below as enemy fighters began their assault on the sniper positions. Chen counted at least 20 combatants making their way up the rocky slope, using natural cover to avoid detection while they closed the distance to the ridge. Her team had perhaps 10 minutes before they would be in direct contact with the ground assault force. Rodriguez grabbed Chen's shoulder and pointed to a group of fighters who had found a concealed approach route up the eastern side of the ridge. They were moving quickly and professionally, indicating this was a planned flanking maneuver rather than a spontaneous reaction. The Ghost's forces had prepared for every contingency, including the elimination of overwatch positions that might interfere with their ambush. Chen made rapid calculations about their remaining options. They could abandon their positions and attempt to withdraw down the western slope, potentially saving themselves, but guaranteeing the death of every SEAL trapped in the compound below. Alternatively, they could remain in place and engage the approaching ground forces, buying time for the assault teams, but almost certainly sacrificing their own lives in the process. The choice was made easier by Morrison's voice over the radio, reporting that his teams were pinned down by increasingly heavy fire and could not attempt movement without sniper support. 3 more SEALs had been wounded, including the team medic, and their ammunition was nearly exhausted. Without covering fire from the ridge, they would be overrun within the hour. Chen turned to Rodriguez and the other members of her sniper team, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through years of training and combat. These were professionals who understood the stakes and were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for their teammates. Without a word, they began repositioning themselves to engage the approaching ground forces while maintaining overwatch on the compound. The first enemy fighters reached the base of the ridge and began climbing toward the sniper positions. Chen shifted her rifle to engage these new targets, taking carefully aimed shots at the climbers while Rodriguez spotted for her and called out additional threats. Her first shot sent one attacker tumbling back down the slope, but the others quickly found cover and began returning fire with automatic weapons. Bullets cracked overhead as Chen worked her way through her remaining ammunition, each shot carefully placed to maximize the impact on the approaching assault force. The rocky terrain provided excellent cover for the defenders, but the enemy had superior numbers and were steadily gaining ground despite taking casualties from the accurate sniper fire. Meanwhile, the situation in the compound continued to deteriorate. Morrison reported that the Ghost's forces were preparing for a final assault, with enemy fighters visible in staging areas around the warehouse. The wounded SEALs were in critical condition, and the team's defensive ammunition was down to less than 2 magazines per man. They had perhaps 15 minutes before their position would be completely overrun. Chen made contact with Colonel Hayes at the forward operating base, requesting immediate close air support or artillery fire on the compound. Hayes responded that weather conditions were still preventing aircraft from reaching the area, and the nearest artillery units were outside effective range. The trapped SEALs were on their own for at least another 4 hours, when the first relief force might be able to reach their location. 4 hours was an eternity in their current situation. Chen looked at her ammunition supply and realized she had fewer than 10 precision rounds remaining, with perhaps 30 rounds of standard ammunition for close-range defense against the approaching ground assault. Her teammates were in similar situations, having expended most of their long-range ammunition in support of the trapped assault teams. The enemy ground assault reached the halfway point up the ridge, close enough now for Chun to see individual faces through her scope. These were hardened fighters, veterans of years of warfare who moved with the confidence of experienced soldiers. They knew they had the Americans trapped and were taking their time to ensure the assault would be successful. Rodriguez called out a priority target, an enemy leader who was coordinating the assault from a position of cover behind a large boulder. Chun shifted her aim and took the shot, watching as the target dropped and created momentary confusion among the assault force. But the enemy quickly adapted, and their advance continued with barely a pause. The radio crackled with reports from other SEAL units in the region, most of whom were engaged in their own firefights and unable to provide assistance. It became clear that the enemy offensive was even larger than initially thought, potentially involving several hundred fighters in a coordinated attack across multiple provinces. The goal appeared to be the complete elimination of American Special Operations Forces in the region, a devastating blow that would take years to recover from. Chen's scope tracked to the Ghost's position in the compound, where she could see him despite his wound continuing to direct the final preparations for overrunning the trapped SEALs. He moved carefully but confidently, clearly believing that victory was within his grasp. The sight of him strengthened Chen's resolve to fight until the last possible moment, knowing that eliminating this high-value target could still salvage something from the disaster unfolding around them. But the approaching ground assault was becoming the immediate priority. Enemy fighters were now less than 50 meters from the sniper positions, close enough to throw grenades and prepare for a final assault. Chun and her teammates had transitioned from precision long-range engagement to close-quarters combat, using their rifles and sidearms to hold off the increasingly aggressive attacks. A grenade exploded near Rodriguez's position, showering the area with rock fragments and temporarily deafening the team. Chen saw her spotter stumble, but continue fighting, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. The enemy was now close enough for individual combat, and the tactical situation had become a desperate fight for survival. Morrison's voice cut through the radio static with an urgent request for immediate fire support on the compound. The Ghost's final assault was beginning, with enemy fighters advancing under cover of heavy weapons fire. The warehouse walls were beginning to crumble under the sustained bombardment, and several SEALs had been wounded by falling debris and ricocheting bullets. Chun faced the most difficult decision of her military career. She could continue engaging the ground assault force that threatened her own team's survival, or she could attempt to provide the covering fire Morrison desperately needed to save the trapped assault teams. Either choice would likely result in the death of American soldiers, but one option offered the possibility of saving more lives than the other. Looking through her scope at the compound below, Chen could see enemy fighters preparing to breach the warehouse walls with explosive charges. Once those walls came down, the trapped SEALs would have no protection from the overwhelming firepower being directed at their position. Without immediate and accurate sniper support, Morrison's teams would be slaughtered where they stood. Chun made her choice, knowing it would probably cost her own life and the lives of her teammates on the ridge. She turned her rifle toward the compound and began engaging the most critical targets, providing covering fire for the assault teams even as enemy fighters closed to within throwing distance of her own position. It was a decision that embodied everything the special operations community stood for: mission first, teammates always, and never leave a fallen comrade behind. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and Sarah Chun prepared to fire the shot that everyone in the compound feared she might never get the chance to take. Time seemed to slow as Chun lined up what she knew would be her final shot of the engagement. Through her scope, she could see the ghost standing in an elevated position, directing his fighters for the assault that would overwhelm Morrison's teams. The range was just over 800 meters, complicated by crosswinds and the stress of incoming fire from the enemy assault force that had nearly reached her position. Rodriguez, despite his head wound, fed her final wind and range estimates while using his rifle to engage the closest enemy fighters. The sound of gunfire was constant now, echoing off the mountain walls as multiple battles raged simultaneously across the ridgeline. Chun blocked out everything except the crosshairs centered on her target, knowing that this single shot could determine the outcome for everyone involved. The ghost raised a radio to his mouth, apparently giving the final order for the assault on the warehouse. Chun could see explosive charges being positioned against the building's walls while enemy fighters prepared to storm through the breaches. Morrison's teams were out of ammunition and options, reduced to fighting with whatever weapons they could salvage from fallen enemies. Chun's finger began its steady pull on the trigger, but movement in her peripheral vision made her pause. An enemy fighter had reached the edge of the ridge and was raising an assault rifle toward her position. Rodriguez saw the threat and attempted to engage, but his rifle jammed at the critical moment, leaving Chun exposed to point-blank fire. Without thinking, she rolled sideways just as the enemy weapon discharged, feeling the bullets crack past her position. The movement threw off her carefully calculated shot, but Chun managed to bring her rifle around and engage the immediate threat before returning to her primary target. Precious seconds had been lost, and she could see that the assault on the warehouse was already beginning. The first explosive charges detonated against the warehouse walls, sending clouds of dust and debris into the morning air. Chun could hear Morrison shouting orders over the radio as his teams prepared for the final stand. Several SEALs were moving wounded teammates to the most protected corner of the building, while others took positions to defend the breaches that would soon be opened in their protective walls. Chun steadied her rifle again and found the ghost in her scope. He was still in position, but now partially concealed by the smoke and dust from the explosions. The shot would be even more challenging now, with reduced visibility and the knowledge that she might not get another chance. Enemy fighters on the ridge were closing in from multiple directions, and Rodriguez was down to his last magazine of ammunition. The warehouse walls collapsed in sections as additional charges exploded, creating multiple breach points for the enemy assault. Chun could see dozens of enemy fighters preparing to rush through the openings, overwhelming the handful of exhausted and wounded SEALs inside. This was the moment the ghost had been planning for, the culmination of months of preparation to eliminate an entire unit of American Special Operations Forces. Through the smoke and chaos, Chun caught a glimpse of her target as he moved to get a better view of the assault. The ghost stepped into the open for just a moment, confident that the sniper threat had been neutralized by his ground assault force. It was the opportunity Chun had been waiting for, possibly the last clear shot she would have before being overrun herself. She made the minute adjustments necessary to account for the changed conditions and began her trigger pull. The crosshairs settled on the ghost's center mass, and Chun felt the familiar calm that came with years of training and experience. This shot would be taken under the most challenging circumstances of her career, with friendly lives hanging in the balance and enemy fighters closing in from all sides. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, sending its payload on the long arc toward the compound below. Chun immediately worked the bolt to chamber her last round, while keeping her eye on the target area through the scope. The bullet's flight time seemed to stretch forever as she watched the ghost continue his coordination of the final assault. The impact was devastating and immediate. The ghost spun backward and fell from his elevated position, disappearing from view as his body struck the ground below. The effect on his forces was instantaneous and dramatic. The coordinated assault began to falter as fighters looked around in confusion, unsure whether to continue the attack or seek new orders from their fallen commander. Chun used the momentary confusion to engage additional targets in the compound, picking off key personnel who were trying to maintain the assault momentum. Her teammates on the ridge, inspired by her example, continued fighting despite being vastly outnumbered and nearly out of ammunition. Every shot counted now, with the lives of their fellow SEALs hanging in the balance. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio with the first good news in hours. The Ghost's death had created enough confusion among the enemy forces that his teams had been able to repel the initial assault and re-establish defensive positions. Several enemy fighters had withdrawn from the breaches, apparently waiting for new orders that would never come. But the tactical situation remained critical. The enemy still had overwhelming numerical superiority, and it was only a matter of time before local commanders reorganized their forces and resumed the attack. Chin's sniper team was down to their last few rounds of ammunition and was about to be overrun by the ground assault force that had nearly reached the ridge crest. Rodriguez called out that relief forces were finally visible in the distance, a column of vehicles approaching from the valley below. Colonel Hayes had managed to get a quick reaction force through the mountain passes despite the challenging weather conditions. The cavalry was coming, but the question remained whether they would arrive in time to prevent a complete disaster. The sight of approaching reinforcements galvanized the remaining SEALs in both the compound and on the ridge. Chun continued to engage targets with her remaining ammunition while coordinating with Morrison's teams to identify priority threats. The enemy forces, realizing that their window of opportunity was closing, intensified their attacks in an attempt to eliminate the Americans before help could arrive. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Chen's life, fighting with rifles, pistols, and eventually hand-to-hand combat. Her team held their position on the ridge while providing whatever support they could to the trapped assault teams. Several times it seemed they would be overwhelmed, only to rally and push back the enemy attacks through sheer determination and superior training. When the relief force finally reached the compound, they found a scene of incredible destruction and heroism. The warehouse was partially collapsed, its walls scarred by explosions and bullet impacts. The ridgeline was littered with the evidence of close combat, with empty ammunition cases and bloodstains marking the positions where the sniper teams had made their final stand. Chin was found at her rifle position, unconscious from blood loss, but still gripping her weapon. She had taken shrapnel from a grenade explosion during the final minutes of the battle but had continued fighting until the relief forces secured the area. Her shot eliminating the Ghost had been the turning point that allowed the trapped SEALs to survive until help arrived. The final casualty count was sobering, but could have been much worse. 15 SEALs had been wounded, some seriously, but all were evacuated successfully for medical treatment. The enemy had suffered devastating losses, with over 100 fighters killed or wounded, and their most important commander eliminated. The intelligence recovered from the Ghost's body and equipment would prove invaluable in disrupting future terrorist operations throughout the region. Chin woke up in a field hospital 3 days later, her left arm immobilized and her body covered with bandages. The first face she saw was Morrison's, who had insisted on staying with the wounded until everyone was stable. He told her that her final shot had saved not just his assault teams, but potentially hundreds of other soldiers who would have been targeted in future attacks planned by the Ghost. The Christmas Eve battle became legendary within the special operations community, studied at military academies as an example of courage under impossible circumstances. Chun received the Medal of Honor for her actions, though she always insisted that every member of her team deserved equal recognition for their heroism that day. Years later, when asked about the shot that everyone feared she might never get the chance to take, Chin would simply say that it was what any professional would have done under the circumstances. She had been trained to protect her teammates and complete the mission, regardless of personal cost. On that cold Christmas Eve in the mountains of Afghanistan, she had done exactly that, proving that America's elite warriors would never abandon each other, no matter how desperate the situation became. The Ghost was finally dead, his network dismantled, and 200 Navy SEALs had lived to fight another day. It was a Christmas miracle born of courage, skill, and the unbreakable bonds forged between warriors who faced death together in defense of freedom.